Cleopatra's poison tests. In 47 BCE, while ruling as Egypt's final pharaonic queen, Cleopatra VII turned her intellectual curiosity toward a disturbing pursuit, the systematic testing of poisons on condemned prisoners. The 22-year-old monarch was known for her keen interest in medicine and toxicology. She authored several texts on the subject, but her research methods revealed a shocking disregard for human life. Working from her palace laboratory overlooking Alexandria's harbor, Cleopatra established a methodical process. Prisoners already sentenced to death were brought before her, unaware they would become test subjects rather than receiving their expected execution. Guards forced the first victims to consume small doses of plant-based toxins, extracts of hemlock, nightshade, and henbane. Cleopatra observed with clinical detachment, recording each symptom in meticulous detail. As subjects convulsed, she noted the timing of their distress. When one prisoner began foaming at the mouth after consuming belladonna extract, she documented the progression. First disorientation, then dilated pupils, followed by racing pulse, and finally respiratory failure. Those who survived the initial test were not spared. Instead, they received progressively higher doses on subsequent days. Prisoners testing mineral poisons like arsenic compounds endured more prolonged suffering. Their symptoms began with violent stomach cramps and progressed to bloody diarrhea. Cleopatra was particularly interested in tracking how long consciousness persisted as organs failed. One account described her approaching victims during their final moments to ask what sensations they felt. The most disturbing experiments involved combinations of toxin. Cleopatra sought the perfect balance, a poison that worked quickly but without excessive visible distress. Victims of these tests experienced multiple symptom cascades simultaneously. Paralysis from one agent while another attacked the heart. Some remained fully aware as their bodies shut down system by system. Her findings would later inform her own suit, but in 30 BCE, when she reportedly chose the relatively quick and painless death offered by asp venom over the lingering suffering she had so carefully documented. Henri de Mondeville's forbidden dissection. In 1315, the respected physician Henri de Mondeville worked in the shadows of Montpellier, France. By day, he taught surgery at the prestigious medical school, advocating for wound cleanliness in an era when most doctors believed pus was beneficial. But as darkness fell, Mondeville's pursuit of anatomical knowledge led him to cross boundaries that would horrify even his most progressive colleagues. Medieval medicine remained largely based on the ancient Greek text that contains significant errors. Mondeville had grown frustrated with these theoretical limitations. He began by examining corpses obtained through bribes to cemetery caretakers. His initial dissections were performed on those already dead, but his observations contradicted Galen's thousand-year-old assertion. The positions of organs, the pathways of blood vessels, they didn't match the accepted text. Soon, examination of the dead wasn't enough. Witnesses later claimed Mondeville paid city guards for access to prisoners condemned to die. These unfortunates were brought to a stone cellar beneath his residence. There they were bound to wooden tables. Mondeville administered crude sedatives, wine mixed with mandragora and opium. But these only partially dulled sensation. The subjects remained conscious, using specialized knives imported from Damascus. Mondeville made precise incisions across the abdomen. The skin was retracted with hooks, exposing the internal organs of still-living subjects. As they gasped and struggled against their restraints, he observed the movement of their intestines, the pulsing of blood vessels, the expansion and contraction of lungs. He inserted probes to trace nerve pathways, noting when certain touches caused specific muscles to spasm. Most disturbing were Mondeville's cardiac observations. He documented how the heart continued beating even as his subjects weakened from blood loss and shock. Some remained conscious for over an hour as he methodically examined their exposed organs, taking detailed notes on parchment with blood-spattered hands. Their fading questions and pleas were recorded as distracting but scientifically noteworthy vocalizations. Guy de Chauliac's plague experiments. In 1348, as the Black Death swept through Europe, physician Guy de Chauliac faced an unprecedented medical crisis in Avignon, France. While most doctors fled, de Chauliac stayed, serving as personal physician to Pope Clement VI. As the disease killed nearly two-thirds of the city's population, de Chauliac's desperation drove him to turn suffering patients into unwitting test subjects for unproven treatments. De Chauliac's position gave him unlimited access to the sick and dying. He began documenting different manifestations of plague, distinguishing between bubonic and pneumonic form. But observation quickly gave way to experimentation. In the papal palace's lower chambers, he established what he called his investigation rooms, where the most desperate patients were brought for treatment. The first experimental treatments involved bloodletting, Chauliac methodically varied the amount of blood drawn from each subject, noting precisely how quickly they died afterward. Some lost consciousness immediately as their already weakened bodies couldn't sustain further fluid loss. Others lingered for hours, their breathing growing increasingly labored as they watched their life drain into collecting bowls. When bloodletting proved ineffective, the Chauliac moved to more invasive procedures. He lanced buboes, the painful lymphatic swellings characteristic of plague, and applied various substances directly into the wounds. Some patients received boluses of dried toads, others had mercury compounds packed into their open sores. The mercury subjects reported intense burning sensations before developing tremors and losing control of their bodily functions. His most disturbing experiments involved primitive respiratory treatments for demonic plague victims. Those struggling to breathe had tubes forced down their throats while various vapors were pumped in. Subjects inhaled concentrated vinegar fumes, herbal smoke, and even the heated urine of non-infected individuals. Many suffered immediate spasms of the throat, effectively choking while fully conscious. Those who survived this initial shock experienced chemical burns to their respiratory passages, making each subsequent breath more painful than the last. De Chauliac meticulously recorded each failed approach, justifying the suffering as necessary for medical advancement. Most subjects died within hours of his experimental treatments. Vivisection in Alexandria. In the 3rd century BCE, Alexandria, Egypt stood as the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Its magnificent library attracted scholars from across the known world, including 2 physicians whose names would become synonymous with both medical advancement and extreme cruelty, Herophilus and Erasistratus. Greek physicians working under the protection of the Ptolemaic rulers conducted what many consider the most disturbing experiments in ancient medical history. Unlike their predecessors who relied on animal dissection, these men gained permission from King Ptolemy I to perform dissections on living humans. Their subjects were the criminals condemned to death, handed over by authorities as already dead in the eyes of the law. Historical accounts estimate that between 300 and 600 individuals underwent vivisection during this period. None survived. The procedures took place in a specially constructed chamber near the library. Subjects were fully conscious as they were strapped to inclined wooden tables. No anesthetics existed beyond wine, which was sometimes withheld to observe unclouded reactions. Using bronze and iron instruments, the physicians made precise initial incisions across the abdomen. Specialized retractors held the skin and muscle layers apart, exposing the internal organs of still living subjects. As subjects screamed, Herophilus mapped the nervous system, tracing the paths of nerves from the spinal cord. He correctly distinguished between sensory and motor nerves by manipulating them in conscious patients, noting which touches caused pain and which caused involuntary movement. Erasistratus focused on the circulatory system, observing blood flow in exposed vessels and the still beating heart. The most valuable subjects were those who remained conscious longest. Some accounts describe physicians asking questions of the vivisected, inquiring about sensations as different organs were manipulated. One victim reportedly remained aware for nearly 2 hours as physicians probed his exposed brain, applying pressure to different areas and documenting the resulting sensory changes or muscle movements. Roman physician Celsus later wrote that while the knowledge gained might benefit future patients, to harm some to benefit others violated the essential principle of medicine, though this ethical concern didn't stop the practice from continuing for decades. Post-experiments. In 18th century Europe, public drew massive crowds, not just commoners but also physicians, anatomists, and natural philosophers eager to conduct experiments on the freshly dead. The guillotine's efficiency had created new scientific questions. How long did consciousness persist after decapitation? Could life be temporarily restored through new electrical techniques? The answers were sought through experiments conducted in the name of science, but with methods that horrified even hardened spectators. On May 14, 1754, in Copenhagen, physiologist Johann Winslow arranged special access to an executed murderer. Within seconds of decapitation, the still warm head was rushed to a waiting table where Winslow began his investigation. He first pricked the face with increasingly sharp implements, carefully noting that the eyelids flinched and the jaw tensed for approximately 2 minutes after separation. When he shouted the condemned man's name directly into the ear, witnesses reported seeing the eyes briefly orient toward the sound. The most disturbing experiments involved Luigi Galvani's electrical theories. In Paris, 1793, as the Reign of Terror produced a steady supply of executed criminals, physician Pierre Jean-Georges Cabani applied electrical currents to severed heads within moments of the blade's fall. The first application caused the eyes to open wide, giving what observers described as a look of bewilderment. The second caused facial muscles to contract into expressions resembling anger or extreme pain. One head reportedly moved its lips as if attempting speech for nearly 4 minutes after separation. Experiments on the decapitated trunk proved equally unsettling. When electrodes were applied to the exposed spinal cord, the arms jerked upward as if reaching for the missing head. Stimulation near the heart caused rhythmic contractions even after the organ had stopped naturally. Some accounts describe limbs moving with sufficient coordination to nearly push the body from the examination table. The most controversial question remained consciousness. German physiologist Samuel Thomas von Summering conducted a series of tests specifically to determine awareness after decapitation. He applied various chemical irritants to exposed brain tissue while watching facial responses. He reported that responsive expressions continued for up to 7 minutes, though with decreasing intensity. The implications that the condemned might experience their own post-mortem examinations disturbed even other scientists, yet the experiments continued for decades, justified as necessary to understand the nature of death itself. The Bronze Bull of Phalaris. In 570 BCE, the Sicilian city of Acragas fell under the control of Phalaris, a tyrant whose name would become synonymous with sadistic cruelty. Unlike rulers who simply executed opponents, Phalaris transformed execution into a grotesque form of entertainment and scientific curiosity. His most infamous creation was the Bronze Bull, a hollow metal statue designed not just to kill, but to create a disturbing acoustic illusion for those gathered to witness the death. The device was created by Parallaeus, an Athenian brass worker who sought the tyrant's favor. The life-size bull was cast from bronze with meticulous attention to anatomical detail. Inside was a hollow chamber large enough to contain an adult human. What made the device uniquely horrific was its acoustic design. A series of tubes and pipes connected the interior chamber to the bull's nostrils and mouth. These were calibrated to transform human screams into sounds resembling a bull's bellows. When a victim was condemned to the bull, they were forced through a door in the side of the statue, which was then sealed shut with bronze bolts. Beneath the bull, attendants built a fire. As the metal heated, the person inside first felt warmth, then increasing heat, and finally the searing pain of contact with metal hot enough to cause immediate burns. There was no quick death. No loss of consciousness from smoke. The pipes that carried their screams also provided just enough air to prolong suffering. Victims first attempted to avoid touching the metal, contorting their bodies to minimize contact, but as the entire chamber heated, this became impossible. Their skin adhered to the superheated bronze. According to accounts, most victims remained conscious for over 20 minutes, as their bodies literally cooked from the outside in. Their screams, distorted through the acoustic pipes, entertained gathered crowds, who heard only the bellowing of a bull rather than human agony. Ironically, Parallaeus himself became the device's first victim. After presenting his invention, Phalaris ordered the crater placed inside to test its effectiveness. Some accounts claim Phalaris had him removed before death, only to then execute him by other means. Others state Parallaeus perished fully in his own creation, experiencing firsthand the suffering he had engineered for others. Tunica Molesta. During the reign of Emperor Nero in the 1st century CE, Rome's Circus Maximus hosted spectacles of unprecedented cruelty. Among the most horrific was the execution method known as Tunica Molesta, the annoying shirt. This form of execution transformed human beings into living torches, combining public entertainment with a methodical exploration of how the human body responded to progressive immolation. The process began with careful preparation. Condemned prisoners, often Christians, political dissidents, or those who had committed crimes against the state, were first stripped and then clothed in a specialized tunic. Unlike ordinary fabric, this garment had been soaked for hours in a mixture of highly flammable substances. The base was typically pitch, pine resin, reinforced with sulfur and naphtha, a naturally occurring petroleum substance that adhered to skin and resisted extinguishing with water. Once clothed in this fatal garment, the victims were led into the arena. There, metal collars were locked around their necks, attached to iron stakes driven into the ground. These restraints were carefully positioned at a height that would ensure the victims remained standing throughout their ordeal, preventing them from attempting to smother the flames by rolling on the ground. As night fell, executioners approached with torches. The ignition typically began at the hem of the tunic. The specialized mixture created flames that spread slowly upward, consuming clothing and flesh in progressive stages. Medical observers noted that victims remained fully conscious during the first stages of burning. The initial minutes brought the agony of superficial burns as the fire consumed the outer layers of skin. As flames climbed higher, victims experienced escalating pain as deeper tissues were affected. Many tried desperately to tear off the burning garments, but the adhesive nature of the mixture made this impossible. The pitch bonded to their melting skin, creating a self-perpetuating fuel source from the victim's own body fat. Roman physician Galen documented that consciousness often persisted for 6 to 8 minutes into the burning process. Victims could be heard screaming coherently, often often pleading or praying, even as their lower extremities were reduced to charred tissue. Eventual death came not from burns alone, but from a combination of shock, fluid loss, and asphyxiation as flames reached the face and smoke filled the lungs. Throughout the process, the victim's immobilized position ensured maximum visibility for the gathered crowds, who watched as human beings were methodically transformed into ash and bone fragments over a span of approximately 20 minutes.